Of quote. Of course, I would agree, but would also add that for this very reason, the governor of RBI and the finance minister not only cannot afford to differ on the overall objectives of our country's economic policy, but also have to agree that the intrinsic objectives of monetary as well as fiscal policy have to be the promotion of social welfare. The governor and the finance minister have recently and rightly agreed that the about to be elected representatives of the people in our parliament would set the inflation target, and it would be the task of the RBI to choose and set the policy instruments at its command to achieve the target. This is indeed the essence of independence of RBI, and not, as it is sometimes claimed, the freedom of RBI to set its own overall economic policy objective independently. This is independence in the choice of instruments, not independence in the choice of objectives. It has to be a decision which is together all the policymakers have to make. Rangarajan concluded, again I quote, "The broad objectives of monetary policies in India have been to maintain reasonable degree of price stability and to help accelerate the rate of economic growth. The emphasis between the two objectives has changed from year to year depending upon the conditions prevailing in that year and in the previous year." He went on to add, drawing on the well-known analysis of Jan Tinbergen, the saint among economists and an economist among saints and a Nobel laureate, that, again I quote Rangarajan, "The choice of a dominant objective arises essentially because of the multiplicity of objectives and inherent conflict among such objectives. Faced with multiple objectives that are equally important and desirable, there is always a problem of assigning to each instrument the most appropriate objective. This assignment rule favors monetary policy as the most appropriate instrument to achieve the objective of price stability. One way of reconciling the conflicting objectives of price stability and economic growth in the short run is through estimating the threshold level of inflation, the level beyond which costs of inflation begin to rise steeply. It is this inflation threshold which will provide some guidance to policymakers. Below this threshold level of inflation, there is greater scope for the policymakers to take into account other considerations. Once the threshold level is crossed, the primary concern of the central bank will be to control inflation." End of quote. I have quoted Rangarajan at length since I think there are some problems with his line of reasoning. It seems to confound the potential conflicts that can arise among objectives of price stability and growth and other social desiderata if they are set independently of each other as specific numerical targets to be attained, with some of them possibly even infeasible to attain, while the deeper issues of trade-off among them as objectives of policy are presumably to be left in the chosen intertemporal social welfare function. Also, while the social welfare function itself would presumably be unchanging over time, the numerical values of trade-offs would naturally depend upon the conditions of the economy at each point of time. Rangarajan did not elaborate on the set of feasible policy choices or equivalently the feasible trade-offs among desiderata at any point of time. Such a set would constrain the policy choices at that point of time. Of course, any combination of the many desiderata that lie on the frontier of the feasibility set would be efficient in a well-defined and well-understood sense of microeconomics. I do not need to tell you, the IGIDR graduates, that the maximization of an appropriately well-behaved intertemporal social welfare function subject to an appropriately well-behaved intertemporal feasibility set will yield a unique optimal intertemporal path for policies or equivalently the desiderata. Whether the path would necessarily exhibit the characteristics of an implicit inflation targeting cannot be determined a priori. Rangarajan seems to imply it would necessarily imply that without explaining or sketching a theory as to why. Governor Rajan in his speech, on the other hand, did sketch the rudiments of a plausible theory for which he invoked the authority of several unnamed but easily recognizable Nobel laureates. In his rendering of the theory, a rise in policy rates leads to lower inflation and to lower growth, and a fall leads to higher inflation and to higher growth. Thus, the best way for the central bank to generate growth in the long run is for it to bring down inflation. Leaving aside whether a central bank could or should generate real GDP growth through its use of its financial sector interventions alone, Rajan argued that as long as inflation is at a rate above a growth-sustaining level, the central bank's objective presumably has to drive it down. Rajan's models and conclusions are deceptively simple. As graduates of IGIDR Pathshala, I'm sure some of you would easily be able to put different specifications for the same ingredients of Rajan's implicit model, such as behavior of aggregate savings and investment and their interest elasticities in particular, the formation of price expectations and their dynamics. These alternative combinations would yield different implications, including the possibility of no or multiple equilibria, some of which are unstable in a well-specified sense, even without bringing fancy information asymmetries and market incompleteness. Be that as it may, the two Rajans and the Urjit Patel committee clearly have a threshold rate of inflation in mind, with the property, first, if the actual rate of inflation is not only below the threshold, but also if the participants in the financial markets and the public at large also believe that the RBI will keep it below it, since the RBI had credibly demonstrated by its policies that it would do everything to keep it below the threshold. Then, to use a colloquial Western phrase, everything will be hunky-dory, with real GDP level and its growth being mildly increasing in inflation rates, if at all. By the same token, heaven forbid, if the actual rate of inflation were to remain above the threshold for some time, raising doubts either about RBI's desire or about its ability to bring it down, again, to use another colloquial Western phrase, all hell will break loose, with real GDP level and growth falling and inflation expectations getting unanchored. Even if one were to believe in the above story as more than simply a fairy tale, but a real one, perhaps of relevance and importance for Western countries where it originated, I have reservations about its relevance and applicability to Indian context. Of course, by questioning its relevance, I am not even for a moment denying the existence of an almost entirely empirical literature or inflation thresholds in India, including papers authored by senior officials of RBI, claiming to have established a threshold rate of 4.5% a year for the wholesale price index, a dubious metric of inflation in the first place. The Patel Committee cites this literature, and a few more later references could also be added to the list. How much time do I ask? The empirical framework of this literature is not behaviorally micro-founded, and its econometric model is not structural. At best, a reduced form. Even that is doubtful. So this empirical literature is not based on a well-founded theory. To the best of my admittedly limited knowledge, the so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, DSGE model, comes close to being internally consistent and coherent. Indeed, there are a few DSGE models for India that have been estimated. Some of the extreme versions of DSGE achieve coherence at a great cost of policy irrelevance, by being an entirely aggregate real sector model and maximizing the single representative consumer's welfare. More realistic versions lose their coherence by introducing ad hoc constraints. Unfortunately, unless I missed it, there is no coherent, overarching, implicit or explicit theory of inflation in the Patel Committee's report, but many ad hoc ones for dealing with different specific complexities of inflation in the real world and in India, such as core versus non-core, seasonal, cyclical, secular versions, impacts on of domestic and external shocks, etc. I can go on adding to the list. For these reasons, I would not attribute any analytical or policy relevance to the specific estimated value of the threshold for us 4 point whatever percent per year, as unfortunately the Patel Committee and the Governor Rajan seem to do. Let me turn to the theory of inflation threshold in Western countries as I understand it. The concept of threshold in the US is closely related to the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU, and the Phillips curve. In the Phillips curve, originally proposed in 1958, a short-run trade-off exists between the rate of unemployment and the rate of increase in nominal wages, or loosely called wage inflation. It is based on the possible inflationary effects in labor and product markets from an increase in national income, output, and employment. It is also not derived from an integrated model of real and financial sectors. Of course, consistent with short life of any macroeconomic concept or theory, Nobel laureate late Milton Friedman, after first denying altogether the short-run Phillips curve and then shifting to their reluctant acceptance in the short run, while claiming the curve would be vertical in the long run, and eventually in the long run also the accepting a possible trade-off. So he himself didn't hold on to a single theory for very long. In any case, a Phillips curve vertical at some threshold unemployment rate could be interpreted as implying that at rates below that threshold, inflation rate is unrelated to unemployment rate, but as the unemployment rate approaches the threshold from below, the inflation rate rises without limit. Now it is easy to see the Phillips curve is nonlinear, in particular if it has the shape of an inverted U, the rate of inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment in the horizontal axis, there would be a unique unemployment rate at which the inflation rate will reach its maximum. I don't need to go on with the dynamics of this, and these are well known. Thus, with the pressure on prices from both the supply side and from the labor cost push side, so to speak, the inflation rises. Empirical estimates of NAIRU suggest that it is not constant over time. Indeed, it varies from year to year, depending upon how it is estimated. This variation, in my view, restricts its usefulness and the associated minimum rate of wage inflation from policy perspectives. There are several reasons why the above framework of the US is of little relevance to the Indian context, in addition to the fact mentioned earlier that it is not implied by or derived from a theory of inflation and estimated using an integrated model of the determination of nominal prices and real magnitudes. First of all, in the US labor market is dominated by wage labor. It is no sense comparable to India. The share of self-employed among males who are usually employed in a principal and or secondary status in rural India in 2011-12 was 55%. This is among males. In females, it was 59%. In the urban areas, again, the share of self-employed among males was 42%, and females it was roughly the same, 43%. On the other hand, the share of those who are employed for a regular wage and salary was only 10% among rural males and 6% among rural females. In urban areas, of course, the share of wage employment was higher at 43% for males and females. It seems to me for the self-employed in India, which is a large proportion of those who are employed, the concept of wages and wage inflation as used in the ways US have little relevance. This share of the employed for whom the share of the employed for whom it may have some relevance in India is very small. But if you look at the manufacturing sector, which is important from many perspectives, the National Sample Survey data show that about 36.4 million workers in the manufacturing sector were working in unorganized enterprises in India. The total number of workers in organized manufacturing sector was only 1.1 million, both in 2005-2006. Now, so the share of unorganized sector in the manufacturing sector workers is close to 90%. So you can easily see, you can't apply a theory which is basically relevance for the organized sector wage employment in the United States to our context. So this is yet another reason for me mechanically using the Phillips curve, the Nairu frameworks of US inflation to India is unwarranted. The empirical econometric literature on estimation of relationship between the rate of inflation, the rate of growth. In this literature, the nonlinearity is postulated in many different ways. One way is to postulate structural breaks in an otherwise linear relationship, that is to say the slope changes at the points of structural break. The other is to postulate a smooth nonlinear relationship between the two. These alternative methods have been used in the empirical literature, and the data used go to the Indian data, using Indian data estimating for India. To the other end, the India among a number of countries for a number of years, data for a number of countries and number of years in the cross-country regression mode. The latter I dismiss completely. There is no particular theory why the same empirical framework to apply to all time, to all countries, and use that for estimation as for one of the countries, namely India. So if we keep to yourself with the Indian data, Indian estimates, which is reviewed in the Patel Committee report, we get this 4.31%, etc., which form the inflation target for India. Now, the choice of appropriate price index for measuring inflation, the move away from the nonsensical WPI, which is neither a consumer price index nor a producer price index and does not include services, to a consumer price-based index, is an appropriate move away from an irrelevant index to something which could be potentially very relevant. There is one problem, unfortunately, with this index. The price quotations are taken from certain chosen centers and rural and urban areas. They are not, strictly speaking, actual prices paid by consumers. Now, if you want to get actual prices paid by consumers, you have to go to the NSS Consumer Expenditure Survey data. Now, as many of you, I'm sure, know, NSS canvasses each round in 4 sub-rounds, independent sub-rounds. So it's possible, in principle, to put together a quarterly price index based on actual prices or unit values that consumers paid in purchasing their consumption bundle every quarter. If we get our data collection and computation together, we can do this. But from policy perspective, it may be quarterly inflation, maybe you may need more frequent information. And for that purpose, perhaps this new CPI would do. India, that policy use can be questioned, as I have done. The policy problem of achieving the objectives of price and financial stability and in sustainable growth at a rapid rate has to be faced. In particular, the credibility of the commitment to fight inflation has to be demonstrated. So I don't want to dismiss the inflation concern of the RBI altogether, but I would phrase it in the context of demonstrating the credibility of the commitment in fighting inflation, commitment of the RBI to fighting the inflation. Now, our Rajans and the Urjit Patel Committee in particular have discussed the issues involved in other papers and lectures in some depth, mostly, in my view, mostly using foreign paradigms to analyze Indian data. But before a decision is made on the Urjit Patel Committee's recommendation, by the way, the Urjit Patel Committee does not mention Parliament determining the inflation target. This was decided by the meeting, rightly, between the finance minister and the governor, as far as I know. I'm sure more discussions and debate of the issues in India's economic structure, in the context of India's economic structure on the report would take place. I urge you, IGIDR graduates, to join the debate in bringing analytical rigor to it. In particular, you could incorporate the fact that a full 15% of India's nominal GDP at current market prices are in the form of the so-called direct savings in the form of physical assets by the misleadingly named household sector. Now, this 15% doesn't go through any financial intermediation by the organized sector financial institutions, and they are the targets of the monetary policy. So the 15% of measured GDP is out. No, not to mention other problems with some parts of the GDP measurement. Now, you could also reflect, as I've argued, that the Indian labor market is very different. Labor market situation is very different, for which the inflation targeting theories, thresholds, etc. were formulated. So you, in principle, could bring some sensible labor market micro features into that could then be used for estimating a threshold inflation rate, if one exists. You could also add to the literature on the dynamics of interrelated and external and domestic shocks, including contagion, on inflation and on other real sector magnitudes for India. The India-specific literature would be very helpful. Thank you all.